I've completed a few this year. It is a psychological horror novel. My main character is the curator of a museum, and she's just arrived at the museum and is getting a tour of the creepy art exhibits. Dad placed an arm around her shoulder and guided her across the hall and down to where a large glass-protected platform sat against the wall. These are an even greater mystery than the wood reliefs. Of course, we wonder if Ettenby himself could have created them, but why? The first question Kenzie had upon looking into the long case was why as well, but for far different reasons. She would not have had the courage to pull the figures before her from whatever murky deeps they had dwelt in for so many long years. She stared into the eyes of an old doll's face, with eyes of coins battered and beaten so that they resembled staring pupils. The short hair of a beaver, or perhaps a bear, sat on top of its head. The bottom half of its face consisted of the back portion of an old shoe-size ruler, the metal kind that some of the better shoe shops still had. It formed a gaping makeshift jaw attached to rings at the back of the head. This one had brown butcher's paper for skin, torn over the torso to reveal ribs made of barrel strapping. Its legs and feet were old railway spikes, cunningly blacksmithed to have rings on the end of them. A profusion of these figures sat crowded in a little glass space, some made with more modern materials. One doll at the front had the head of a cherub made from milky glass, cracked with age and sporting brown dirt veins. Its body was a large tin can for oil, banged into the shape of a corseted torso, its arms a pair of funnels. The hands were china as well, with dirty fingernails. Several had tin cans or pots for heads, banged, dinged, and augmented into eerie faces. Even in their makeshift state, they all looked strangely complete. They all had joints and a full body. Some of the ways that everyday items had been modified were ingenious, and yet, "You're right, I'm wondering why," Kenzie said briskly. "We're thinking that they're folk art, crafts made by someone locally to stave off the boredom of living on the frontier. And yet, some of the artifacts date to the early 20th century. Ettenby died before the turn of the century." Kenzie nodded. One of them had an early car headlamp as the basis of its head. Others were strapped together with old insulated appliance cables. Perhaps his heirs brought them for some reason and were storing them here? Dad cleared his breath through his nose, as he often did when struggling with a real problem. If they did, then they got misplaced somewhere along the line. "Come along and see the rest of the museum, and then I'll show you where we found them." Kenzie followed, reluctant to turn her back on the dolls, not because she feared they would move, but because she feared that she would move before figuring out why they existed in the first place. She was overcome with fascination of the most dreadful kind, the kind that made her want to stare and stare until some sort of sense came out of staring at them, accompanied by the feeling that perhaps there was no sense to be made. It was all just a spiral. Did dolls feel like the right word for them? Not really. She'd have to think on it. Think on it, Kenzie did, right through the rest of the museum, thoughts rolling through her head, fascination mingling with revulsion, and a steady ebb and flow of inspiration. The dolls were shocking, truly shocking. And although it may take time to adjust to as a regular resident of the museum, that was precisely the kind of thing that put museums on the map. Add in the mystery of their provenance and history, and within a few years, National Geographic could be knocking on their door. Strategies climbed through her head like towers of Tinkertoy, only to be knocked down by the latest and greatest idea that had just then presented itself. She hoarded a few for later use, which she was sure Dad would go for. Pushing the mystery would be key. Not knowing would draw people in, and those creepy little faces would keep them there. Think of the Halloween tie-ins. They breezed through the library, redolent of old paper and well-stocked with reading nooks and old granny volunteers to shuttle people in the right direction and shush them appropriately. In the next wing, Dad showed her through a series of rooms on the upper floor which had been preserved in their original state, complete with period furniture and accurate home accessories. Here, mostly younger volunteers shuttled through, getting their summer experience for high school transcripts or college degrees by explaining the history of the log palace and information about life in the 19th century. It was all pretty standard stuff, available at most historical estates these days. The lower floor held a white-walled, sanitized children's exhibit, where specific replica objects and things that could not be hurt, mostly stone objects and some bricks, were laid out in colorful settings with little picture quizzes and button games alongside for those who were waiting. A video in a darkened room at the end of the hall played a video about games and songs for 19th century children. At the end of the tour, Dad brought them back to the stairs leading to the folk art wing. Underneath the staircase, there was a fairly large hatch in the floor. The top had been covered in linoleum, and the handle had been painted, but Kenzie could tell from the pitting of the handle and the shape that it was actually very old. Dad pulled his keys out from his pocket and undid the lock on the hatch. He squeezed the flashlight on his keychain and flickered it at Kenzie in a playful manner. Right in the eyes, of course. She held her hands up to stave off the glare. "We'll need this," he said. "It's dark in there." The hatch was about 4 foot square, enough for someone to descend into without too much claustrophobia. Would they be going down into some drafty, low-ceiling sub-basement? She hoped not, at least not without masks on. "Watch out for the edge, Daniel," said Mom. Dad ignored her and pulled the trap door up, toes practically teetering over the lip of the shaft. Kenzie crept forward, leaning over it at a safe distance. A shaft it was, and a deep one, at least 50 feet, perhaps 75. Interlocked limestone flagging lined its walls and bottom, only just illuminated by the power of Dad's tiny little light, and it looked dry as dust. Odd for an island in the middle of 2 rivers on a very shallow piece of earth. Much odder was the fact that it went nowhere. No evidence of blocked up doors, spur tunnels, or cave-ins. It was simply a very deep, very dry hole. It felt like an oubliette, where you drop things you wanted to forget about. "The dolls were stuck down in a pile," Dad said, "like prisoners with no hope of escape. Still, it seemed as though they reached for the light. It's odd how human that human-shaped things can seem, isn't it?" Kenzie felt a draft of dry, stale air puff up at her from the hole, as if it were sniffing her and found her too strong. She backed up, startled, coughing. "I think it was a way to gauge flooding," Mom said. "If the water levels were high, then they would know something was wrong, to get on the boats." "Mandy, we've been through this before. There is no evidence that that tunnel has ever been underwater," said Dad, clearly irritated not only with this comment, but her half-baked running commentary throughout the tour. "I know," she said, taking one last look into the tunnel before it was shut. "You've told me, but I just feel like it has been." Kenzie kept quiet this time, but was surprised to find that she sided more with Mom than Dad. All logic aside, it did feel as though there had been water in that tunnel once. She pictured water flooding up through it, menacing the residents of the house from right below the floorboards. She pictured the hatch bumping it against an unseen chop from below. Bump, bump, bump. And so just skipping ahead a little bit. Simulacra, she thought as she threw the last of her luggage onto the new bed. That's the word I've been looking for all afternoon. They're not dolls, they're simulacra. This she knew very well without knowing exactly how she knew it, except that dolls usually had some social function. Dolls were rounded, meant to be pleasing more often than not, or meant to represent something identifiable. The things in the folk art gallery were all mechanics, hollow and bony, shells of human things that thought they looked human. You could not hug something with skin of paper, nor play with it. Mechanical skeletons made of junk were not meant to be displayed anywhere but a museum. It was as if someone had decided to mimic the human form with no other aim than to make a copy in its own particular style, like a cave painting of a buffalo or a cubist still life. Kenzie looked out the windows. Her new bedroom was dry-walled and modern-looking, like the rest of the museum, excluding the historical wing, but the windows still showed the rough-hewn logs forming the walls, and the glass in the frames were original. A century and a half of bumpy paint coated the wood holding the 6 panes of wavy glass together. Outside, she could see the visitors' parking lot. The staff quarters were at the front of the building, on the 2nd floor through a door leading from the back wall of the folk art gallery. She did not relish the thought of passing those staring carvings every day, but she handled the stares of her classmates, so at least these eyes were inanimate. Then again, she wasn't so sure a lot of her old classmates weren't made of wood either, the way they behaved. 5 years with almost no hint of human kindness to help light her way, an existence drier than that old tunnel. So she goes to bed, so I'm just going to skip ahead a little bit. Kenzie changed into long pajamas, sadly one of the cuter items in her wardrobe with little smiley owls on them, and then got into bed. The mattress was nice, but it was still going to feel like a hotel for a few days while she got oriented. She'd probably wake up a couple of times, thinking her bed was the wrong way and wondering in the dark where she was before she remembered. She woke up by the hole. The hole was open. Why was it open? Cold air puffed up out of it, but this time the dusty smell was gone. This time it smelled like a dock on open fresh water. She heard the water below, lapping against something, causing it to bump. She looked down, unsure why she could see, but the hole was lit as if the moon shone right through the roof. Down below, standing in 3 feet of water, Kenzie stood. 11-year-old Kenzie. Kenzie in a white night shift she had been given by her grandmother that had been ruined when she was 15 and experimenting with hair dye. Her long, brown, straight hair spilled over her shoulders. Her eyes were tired, as if she'd been kept up far too late and run laps during the day. "You're going to kill me," the young Kenzie whispered, a tear spilling down one cheek. "And I deserve it." The words echoed up the tunnel, causing them to hiss and bark off of the stones. Kenzie would have screamed. She should have run. She should have cried or fallen to the floor or anything, but another power was in control, within her and yet not created entirely by her. Totally numb from head to toe, she averted her eyes from young Kenzie, closed the hatch, and walked smoothly and evenly up the stairs to the folk art wing. A knife of cold fear stabbed her, however, when she realized that she would have to pass through the darkened gallery with the staring carvings. She padded up the stairs as quietly as she could, feeling like she had at 11 when she had been eavesdropping on adult things that she longed to know but could not ask about. She reached the picture gallery. The moon shone in through the skylight, illuminating the path to the door along the rear wall. She edged into the gallery, her eyes on the wall, but not focused. There were more than 3 sets of eyes in the carvings. The native people on the far bank now turned and stared at her with those ivory-covered almonds, and they glowed in the dark. The water lilies had formed into faces, also staring. In the woods, nothing stared. A simulacrum slumped at the base of the tree, its half-broken body both naturalistic and completely unnatural. Kenzie could feel her hands trembling, her knees shaking. She stared back at the eyes the way a rabbit stares at a looming snake, watching for the strike. The eyes had changed, but still nothing moved, at least not that she could see. Her bare feet hit the cold floor again and again, and she felt every sensation heightened, especially the cold. The eyes glowed and stared, and she inched excruciatingly before them. Finally, her hand hit the knob for the door to the dorms. She opened it, ducked inside, and closed it as quickly and quietly as possible. A flashlight beam flicked on, shining out of the pitch black. She blinked and swore. "Kenzie, what are you doing out of bed? We thought there was an intruder," said Dad. "You're lucky you didn't trip any of the alarms. Raoul down at the fire department doesn't take too kindly to false alarms this far out of town, you know." Kenzie shook her head, feeling suddenly very heavy and off balance, like an old silo with too many bricks missing. "I think I'm sleepwalking again," she said. Thank you.
That was very creepy.
Yay!
Yes.
Creepy. I love being creepy.
This video brought to you by the works of Stephen B. Pearl, the finest in speculative fiction.